Hey, everyone. Can you see me? I'm having some problems here. Sorry about that, everybody. I'm having a few issues here. Can you hear me? Can everyone hear me there? Yes, yes. Something weird going on with my screen. Okay. I'm getting a yes that you can hear me. Uh, Sorry about that. A little weird, little something funky going on. You like my shirt here? Jerusalem? I thought you might like it. Bought it in Jerusalem, actually. But hey, we are going to get going here. Um, Warm day here on the East Coast of the United States. Wow, I jogged earlier with a t-shirt and shorts on, October 20th. Pretty interesting, but we have a lot to talk about today. It's warm here. It's warm. It's hot. It's heating up in the Middle East as well, and we've got a lot to talk about today. We're going to get into a few subjects. Number one, Israel this week, reportedly, the Israeli government approved a budget specifically tailored this budget towards an attack plan against Iran's nuclear facilities. So that's one topic that we will talk about. And guess what? The budget is $1.5 billion. It is quite a budget, to say the least, that Israel has put together reportedly to strike Iran's nuclear facilities. That's number one. We also want to talk about this growing Russia Iran military alliance. We had the chiefs of staff of both countries meeting this week. So we're going to talk about that as well. We want to get deeper into this Hezbollah story that we reported on yesterday here on the newscast. 100,000 fighters in Hezbollah, according to Hezbollah leader Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah. Is that true? Is that false? Is it bluster? Is he exaggerating? We will talk about that as well. Also, I think we should talk about a little bit. We focus so much on the Middle East here in the newscast, but I think we should talk slightly about the China hypersonic missile test. Many believe that the Chinese regime are the kings of the East, talked about in the book of Revelation. You know, the book of Revelation talks about in the last days a 200 million man army crossing the Euphrates River. And pardon me, I'm sweating just a little bit because I jogged a little bit earlier and I'm still all heated up. A lot of times I like to go out and jog and clear my head and think about what I'm going to talk about. So that's what I did. I'm still a little heated up as I get in here, but I didn't want to be late for our 4 o'clock Eastern date. So pardon me as I dab just a little bit and dry off. A warm day again here in the East Coast, but let's talk about China. That 200 million man army that crosses the Euphrates River. Look, is that some believe it's a supernatural army. Others believe that the kings of the East are indeed led by China, a confederation of Asian nations. What do you think? I'd like to see your comments here. We've got many prophecy buffs, I would say, here on the Watchman Newscast. And that's why I love these 1 hour live streams, because we can really dig into things deeper. So, Iran and Russia, Israel attack plan for Iran, Hezbollah, China hypersonic missile. Also, I would like to discuss briefly a testimony story. Now, I teased it on last week's live stream. Remember, we're doing one of these per week now, one live stream per week, usually on Thursdays. Today is a Wednesday. It varies, but it will be on Wednesday or Thursday. But the majority of time, every week, once a week, we will do it on Thursdays here on the Watchman YouTube channel. We go for one solid hour. And since we have more time during the live streams, I am going to, from time to time, share some testimony stories. Don't worry, it will be short, but share some of my personal story. Hey, you watch me every day here on the Watchman Newscast. You're probably wondering, what's this guy all about? Where's he from? What's his backstory? And I enjoy sharing it. I enjoy sharing my testimony about how I came to do what I do today, number one. But number two, even more importantly, how I accepted Jesus into my heart and how I became a Christian. I wasn't always like this, and I wasn't always doing this. So I love to share those brief nuggets, I guess you would say, from my testimony. We'll do that a bit later as well. And of course, we will have our Q&A session. People already sent some good ones in the comments section over the past 2 days. Continue to send them. I can see the chat here actually. So continue to send them and I can see the chat. And my trusty producer today, it is Grace. Daniel is out of town. God bless the guy. He needs a vacation. So Grace will be sending me along your questions as well and monitoring the chat room and all of the questions. I'm just looking at some of the places where people are watching from. Hello from Israel. Nice. Canada. We have Africa. We have Montreal, Canada, of course. We have across the United States. We'll get people from the Philippines, Africa, everywhere on this live stream over the next few hours to see a sweaty watchman. Ugh, I hate to say that, who just fresh off the streets going for a jog, but it helps to keep my mind sharp. What can I say? To get a little bit of exercise on a nice day like today. Pittsburgh, PA, a fellow Pennsylvania watching as well. Okay, let's get into it. Israel this week, according to the Israeli television station, Channel 12, it's called in Israel, one of the leading TV networks there. Israel reportedly, the Israeli government of Naftali Bennett, the still relatively new government, which came into office in June 2021, has reportedly approved, and I guess you would call it an attack budget geared towards Iran's nuclear facilities. Let me preface this by saying that does not guarantee that Israel will strike Iran. It's not a guarantee. What it does guarantee is that Israel certainly is preparing and taking steps in case they need to strike Iran's nuclear weapons program. That's what it means. It doesn't mean it's a done deal, but number one, it's a message, a very public message, and Israeli officials have been sending this message over the past several months, right? Even before the Bennett government, obviously for years, the former prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, was also sending that same message to the Iranian regime saying, look, we will strike. If the world doesn't want to act, Israel will act alone if need be. So that message has been sent by Israeli leaders for years now, successive Israeli administrations, and very public. And again, they're talking openly. The defense minister, Benny Gantz, said this week that our number one priority in this budget is Iran and Iran's nuclear program. So the message is being clearly sent. $1.5 billion. What does that include? Well, it reportedly includes money for fighter jets, for drones, intelligence gathering drones first. Secondly, I'm sure attack drones are in the mix as well. And a variety of other armaments is all the Channel 12 report said, armaments that Israel would need to carry out a successful attack against Iran's nuclear weapons facilities. Someone commented yesterday and said, these are just nuclear facilities. You can't say that they're nuclear weapons facilities. Oh, yes, I can. Iran has nuclear facilities for one reason and one reason only, to develop nuclear weapons. That's why they have the facilities. So here on the newscast, we'll call them nuclear weapons facilities. We don't have our head in the sand. We know exactly what the Iranian regime is doing. So the money is set aside, and even the Israel Defense Forces Chief of Staff, Aviv Kohavi, said this a few months ago. Look, we're putting a budget together, a major new budget geared towards stopping that nuclear program. How clear can Israel be with the world, folks? How much more clear, I should say? I feel like, judging by some of our comments, I feel like it's almost a boy who cried wolf type situation, if you know what I mean. A lot of commenters have said in recent weeks and months even that, look, Israel's been talking about this for years and it never happens. As far back as 2009, 2010, we were hearing that Israel is going to strike Iran's nuclear weapons facilities. We heard it really go into overdrive between 2011 and 2013 under Barack Obama, that very friendly U.S. administration, when Israel knew he was in office and that he was hell-bent on establishing that Iran nuclear deal. Then the chatter, I guess you would say, really heated up, but it didn't happen. Prime Minister Netanyahu, up until June 2021, when he left office, talked about it constantly, the potential strike on Iran's nuclear facilities. It didn't happen. And now the new Israeli government is talking about it as well. So some people have said this is like the boy who cried wolf. Israel talks about it and talks about it and warns about it and warns about it and says it's coming, but it never comes. I would caution anyone that's thinking that. I would say that Israel has been certainly very patient with this Iran dilemma. But I'll actually quote Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. I never thought I would quote him, but I'm doing it. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the very wicked former president of Iran, who said a few years back when he was still president that Iran's nuclear program is like a train with no brakes. It's a runaway train that cannot be stopped. Now, he was right about that from the Iranian perspective. Israel has something to say about that, though. But he was very transparent there to telegraph how the Iranian regime feels. This nuclear program is never going to stop. It's for keeps, and we're not going to stop until we have the bomb. Okay, that's one part of this. The second part is the Iranian regime is very patient. And remember, the game of chess was created in ancient Persia, which is modern day Iran. These are very savvy, very smart chess players who are very patient. They're playing the long game. So combine those two factors, and this is not the type of decision on Israel's side where Israel can just act rashly and suddenly and bomb Iran's nuclear facilities. I'm giving you an Israeli viewpoint. Israel is saying, look, we need pretty much as close as we can get to a smoking gun. Iran is developing the bomb. That's without a doubt. Look, we saw the smoking gun to that effect in 2018 when the Mossad, with that daring operation in Tehran, was able to smuggle out those essentially nuclear blueprints and top secret sensitive Iranian nuclear documents that then Prime Minister Netanyahu revealed to the world, which showed, yes, Iran is developing the bomb and they intend to develop the bomb. But what Israel's going to, because the world's going to howl, folks. If and when Israel strikes Iran's nuclear weapons facilities, what will the reaction of the world be? Just overwhelming condemnation of Israel, including from, if this is the administration, the Biden administration, including from the U.S. administration. Now, rewind to 1981 when Israel struck the Osirak nuclear reactor, Saddam Hussein's nuclear reactor in Iraq, under Prime Minister Menachem Begin. Same deal. The world howled, the world condemned Israel, but I would think that 40 years later, we can all agree that Israel did the world a favor to prevent Saddam Hussein from having nuclear weapons. The same goes for Israel's 2007 strike against the Syrian nuclear reactor. Once again, could you imagine Syria now? A nuclear-armed Assad regime, what would have happened? Talk about a nightmare scenario. 500,000 people killed in that country in the past decade during the Syrian civil war. Iran, Russia, Turkey, Hezbollah, all entrenched in that country at Israel's doorstep. Again, Israel did the world a favor. But in this case, Israel believes that they're going to need just an open and shut case to present to the world. I think you would say a case where they're saying, here's what Iran was up to. Here is how close they were. So we had no choice but to act against this existential threat. Now, this thing has been dragged out for years for a few reasons. Number one, well, I would say the main reason would be the Obama administration. Rewinding, the Obama administration was adamantly opposed to an Israeli strike against Iran's nuclear facilities. Israel under Netanyahu was reportedly close back in 2012 even. And then came the Iran nuclear deal. So the world would have said, if Israel struck during that time when that Iran nuclear deal was in force, what would the world have howled? The world would have howled that Iran was compliant. We've got this nuclear deal, and Israel, you ruined everything by carrying out a military strike. How dare you do that? The US, Russia, China, Germany, France, Britain howling in anger at Israel. And it would have been a tough go diplomatically, let's just say that. And if and when Israel does feel compelled to eliminate what is an existential threat to the world's one and only Jewish state, that there will be blowback. Iran will strike back, most likely through that ring of fire that surrounds Israel. We call it the ring of fire. Iran's proxies, which are armed to the teeth with missiles, rockets, and attack drones. We're talking Hezbollah, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, the various Shia militias in Iraq and Syria who literally encircle Israel, which, just a healthy reminder, a helpful reminder, is the size of the state of New Jersey. If you live here in the United States like me, you know that New Jersey is not a very big state, and that's the size of Israel. You can traverse the country in one day. In about 9 hours, you can go from the utmost north of Israel to the utmost south, from Mount Hermon to Eilat in the Red Sea. So, needless to say, when a country with those geographic challenges is surrounded on all sides by tens of thousands, likely over 200,000 if you add all of the proxies arsenals. Hezbollah alone has some 150,000. If you add them all up, Israel is likely surrounded by some 200,000 rockets and missiles on every side, quite literally, and also a growing arsenal of Iranian supplied attack drones. So that's the situation Israel faces. And if and when Israel says, wow, our intelligence says, and Israel's intelligence is among the best, our intelligence says that Iran is very, very close to breaking out. They're going to test a nuclear bomb or something to that effect. And Israel says the world's not going to act. The United States is not going to act. We have no choice to preserve our nation and prevent a second Holocaust. We have no choice but to preemptively act and eliminate this existential threat. That, folks, could indeed still happen. The boy who cried wolf chatter that I'm seeing, I wouldn't be so sure. Things don't always happen overnight. And let me preface that again by saying no one wants to see that. Ideally, the Iranian regime, and no one wants to see that more than Israel. Ideally, the Iranian regime would put aside this nuclear program. They'd give it up and they'd say, you know what? We're not going to pursue nuclear weapons anymore. We truly do want to be a responsible part of the world, a responsible nation that gets along with its neighbors, that no longer sponsors terrorism, that no longer oppresses its own people who are the main victims of this regime. We've changed. We're not going to do that anymore. We're going to take a straight path, and we're going to avoid that kind of behavior. Ideally, that would happen. And the world would say, okay, Iran, let's see. Actions speak louder than words. But if you are sincere and you change Iranian regime, then look, you can economically, sanctions will be dropped. Economically, you'll prosper. You'll benefit from this change of heart. That is the best case scenario. Unfortunately, you, wherever you're watching from, and I know that ain't going to happen with this current Iranian regime. They are who you see. This is a radical, apocalyptic, jihadist regime that will not change. It's an evil, wicked regime. I'm talking about the regime, not the Iranian people. Key point. The Iranian people suffer under the jackboot of this regime more than anyone else. But this regime's not going to change, folks. And if they're not going to change, and their ideology is a commitment to destroying Israel, and they're going to continue to work on the nuclear program, again, a train with no brakes, what is Israel to do? The world will stand by and allow Iran to acquire the bomb, without a doubt. The world says, well, you know what? That's Israel's problem. Tough break for them, and tough break for the Saudis and the Sunni Arab nations that surround Israel, but we don't have to worry about it. We are sitting comfortably here in the United States or Europe, even though the Iranian regime continues to work on intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, that do exactly what their name says. They are designed to travel across continents, across oceans. But the world doesn't seem to give too much heed to that fact. And Israel feels all alone. And if Israel feels isolated in dealing with this threat, what would you do if you were Israel? Would you take your chance? Would you throw caution to the wind and say, you know what? We're just going to keep our fingers crossed, and we're going to say, Okay, Iran, we're going to let you get the bomb. We're going to let you acquire the capability to achieve your stated goal of destroying us. We'll let you have it, and we'll just kind of keep our fingers crossed and pray and hope that you don't use it, that you're not in a bad mood one day and decide to nuke Tel Aviv. Would you do that if you were Israel and live every day in constant anxiety and what if, walking on eggshells? Or would you act? Would you say this is an intolerable situation? And although we know that if we strike Iran's nuclear facilities, there will be quote unquote blowback. It may lead to a regional war. It's going to be nasty, but we'll get through it. Would you choose the short term pain, which surely will come? There will be Hezbollah, there's going to be nasty conflict if and when Israel strikes Iran's nuclear program. Or would you choose your long term demise? Because the Iranian regime, what's to say one day they get the bomb? What's to say in 5 years they decide to use it? They have a radical leadership right now, very radical, the most radical Iranian government we've ever seen since 1979. And that's saying something. What if we get someone who's even more radical and even more unhinged at the helm in Tehran? It's very possible. You thought what we had now was bad? Perhaps there's someone worse waiting in the wings somewhere who won't show the tactfulness or play the chess and play the long game that Iran's current leaders are using, but someone who's off, even more off his rocker, and says, let's launch. Can Israel take this chance? What would you do if you were in Israel's shoes? Everyone who says Israel can't strike Iran's nuclear facilities, they shouldn't do it, I never hear an alternative as to what Israel should do. Should Israel sit and wait and allow Iran to acquire the bomb? You might counter by saying, well, Erick, look, the Iran nuclear deal, that's the answer because it puts curbs on Iran's nuclear development and it may delay what they're doing. They may behave themselves for a few years. Say the deal, the reincarnation of the deal, lasts for 10 years. But then what happens? You're kicking the can down the road. You're just delaying the inevitable and kicking the problem down the road. Once the deal is up, once the sun sets on the deal, then what? Then what happens? Iran is free to do what it wants. Okay, we'll wait. We'll wait the West. We'll wait them out for 10 years. We'll play their little game in order to get sanctions lifted. If we sign this deal, they'll lift sanctions. We'll reap all the benefits, and we'll use that sanctions relief, those billions of dollars, to fund terrorism, to buy more weapons, to build up the nuclear program. And then when we'll be good little boys for 10 years. Then when that's up, we'll break out and we'll have the bomb. And what you say, what do you mean break out? Well, US, Israeli, and other intelligence estimates, including European intelligence, have all said that if Iran so chooses, they could break out within 2 months. 2 months, 8 to 10 weeks, they could break out. They could break out, test a bomb, perhaps. They have enough. They could have enough enriched uranium. Not to get too in the weeds on how it works with centrifuges, enriched uranium, all of it. Just know this: Iran could have enough enriched uranium to build a bomb very soon if they so choose. And they're using that if they so choose part to blackmail the world or try to blackmail the world. They're saying, if you don't give us what we want and lift the sanctions, we may just break out and test a bomb, or we may just choose we're all in and we're going to build a bomb. We may just enrich uranium to a level where there's to the point of no return, where there's no turning back. It's blackmail and it's extortion. And guess what? The West is falling right into it, which brings us full circle. If the West is going to fall for the blackmail and the extortion, what should Israel do? What do you think? Leave some comments. I think Israel needs to do what it needs to do to preserve its existence. And that will likely entail eventually, if things don't change, and we all pray that they do. But if we keep going down this road, It might be 15 years from now. It might be, and there might be a new Iran deal for 10 years. It ends in uh, 2031 or 2032. And Israel might feel compelled to strike then once the sun sets on the deal. It might be a year, 2 years from now. Who knows? But my bottom line is if I'm in Israel's shoes, I can't live with this. I can't live under these circumstances with my mortal enemy who is devoted to my destruction, ideologically devoted, religiously devoted to my destruction, possessing the weapons that would accomplish exactly that. It's an intolerable situation that Israel can't live with. And folks, Israeli political factions, even on the left, can agree we can't accept this because there's a good chance we'll all die if we try to live with a nuclear Iran. And look, the scenario is Iran passing that nuclear technology off to its proxies and other bad actors in the region, sparking a nuclear arms race where the entire Muslim world is looking to go nuclear. Look, the nightmare scenarios are never ending, including, again, those intercontinental ballistic missiles. I'm sitting here in the United States. Hey, those ICBMs aren't for Israel, Saudi Arabia, or even Europe. They're for us, the nation that Iran calls the Great Satan. And by the way, at those rallies, when it chants death to Israel, it's combined with chants of death to America and fist pumps, I should say. So that's the situation. Now, we're talking about Iran and Russia as well. I want to welcome everyone. I kind of just went off there for a bit, but I'm glad you had to hear it. And people ask you about the reasons why Iran should not be permitted to acquire nuclear weapons. I just gave you some. If you started late, we're going for a full hour here. We are going until 4 p.m. Eastern time. We've got thousands of people with us right now. And if you missed any in the beginning, you can just check us out here on our YouTube channel in the archives. We will post this under newscasts. I apologize for the first few minutes. I said, man, I have to go for a jog. I have to think about what I'm going to talk about today and clear my head a little bit. It's a beautiful day. Went for a jog and then kind of hopped in here in the hot seat, still kind of perspiring, I'll say a little bit. So dabbing, not dabbing like the NFL dance, but dabbing my forehead a bit, as you'll see early on in the video. So my apologies. Hopefully it's not too distracting, but you know what? The run did its job and I was able to think about what I'm going to say. And we've had some good stuff to talk about, including the Iran-Russia alliance. Hey, the chief of staff for the Russian military was in Tehran this week meeting with the chief of staff from Iran, the counterparts getting together, and not too many huge headlines to come out of this meeting other than the fact that they met, which is troubling enough, right? It was reported in Iran's Tasnim news agency, one of the official mouthpieces for the Iranian regime. It wasn't a very detailed piece, but they're about the only ones I saw covering what I consider a very important meeting in the times we are living in. The head of Russia's military and the head of Iran's military vowing closer cooperation. Not a good thing when you think about the Ezekiel scenario, or should I say, not a good thing on one hand, certainly, to see bad actors come together. But if you read the book of Ezekiel, chapter 38 and 39, it's ultimately not a good thing for Russia and Iran and Turkey and anyone else who is a member of that confederation. So they're kind of sowing the seeds of their own demise. If you read scripture and you read the outcome of the Gog Magog war, to say the least. So let me rephrase that a bit. But they're meeting, and clearly they're talking about Syria. And you're going to continue to hear Syria being mentioned by Russian leaders in Israel. And for one reason only, chiefly, I should say, not only, but chiefly, we've been talking about it here in the newscast frequently over the past several months, really the past year. Iran is in Syria at Israel's doorstep along with Hezbollah. They're trying to establish a beachhead from which they can launch attacks against Israel from Syria. They want to duplicate what they have in southern Lebanon with Hezbollah. Israel says, no way, red line. Unlike some, Israel keeps its red lines. So Israel and Iran are on a collision course right now over Syria. Israel has conducted perhaps even thousands of airstrikes against Iranian and Hezbollah and various radical jihadi assets inside Syria over the past decade. Russia does not like this. And we've been reporting on the increased tension between Russia and Israel over Syria in recent months. Russia is supplying the Assad regime in Syria with advanced missile defense systems to defend against Israeli airstrikes. And it is becoming perhaps a little more difficult for Israel to maneuver in Syrian airspace. We had a report the other day that Israel did indeed carry out a strike in Palmyra, in central or around Palmyra in central Syria, took out some Iran backed fighters. But a Russian military official came out in the aftermath of that strike last week and said, Israel used two civilian airliners as cover when they carried out those strikes, because they kind of, I don't know if they hid around the civilian airliners or how it worked, but they used them as cover to carry out the strikes, meaning the Syrian air defenses weren't going to fire when there were civilian airliners in the air and cause a major international incident, a disaster for the Syrian regime, shooting down two civilian airliners. So Russia, and not in a complimentary way, um, came out and kind of revealed that, alleged that, I should say. Is it true? We don't know. But that gives you an idea that Russia is kind of calling Israel out now for what Israel's doing in Syria. Let me just say what Israel is rightly doing in Syria, because if they allow Iran to really establish that foothold in Syria, you will have Lebanon Part 2 at Israel's border. Folks, if Israel sat back and did nothing over the past decade when it comes to Syria, and it allowed Iran to establish a foothold on the Golan Heights, you know how Hezbollah has 150,000 rockets and missiles at least perched along the Israel-Lebanon border? You'd have a similar scenario right next door in Syria. Iran by now would have moved in rockets, missiles right on Israel's Syrian doorstep as well. And that's why Israel has felt compelled to act. It's really, if you're not, if you have an ounce of moral clarity in your body, in your mind, in your spirit, and in your heart, and an ounce of common sense, and if you're an intellectually and morally honest person, it's pretty obvious why Israel would strike Iran and Syria, and it's pretty obvious why Israel may feel compelled to strike Iran's nuclear weapons facilities. They are defending their existence. This is not hard to see why Israel is doing what it is doing in both situations. But if you have complete hateful, anti Semitic, anti Israel blinders on, then you're not going to see it that way. To me, it's when it comes to the Iran issue, it's not hard to see why Israel is acting the way carrying out the actions it is carrying out. To do otherwise would very likely mean the end of Israel. We've read the book. We know that's not going to happen. But nevertheless, Israel has to act in a wise manner to defend its people. When Israeli leaders say never again, they truly mean never again. And that's really across the political divide in Israel. So we're keeping an eye on Russia and Israel shortly. We'll be getting a question shortly. Keep them coming real quick. I'm going to look down at my phone, and my trusty producer, Grace, is sending along some questions. Let's see what we have. We've got a lot. This is going to be good. We've got a lot. And by the way, what I don't get to today, I'm going to try to get to either on tomorrow or Friday's newscast a few additional questions. Keep them coming every week. We have thousands of people here. We have a bunch of people commenting. It's impossible for me to get to all of them, but I'm trying. And I read your questions, and I appreciate, even if I don't answer your question, you bring up a lot of food for thought. Some of the questions are excellent, and they could give story ideas or segment ideas where I say, wow, okay, that's actually a good point. You've heard me say that a few times during the Q&A sessions. We actually did an entire newscast last week on who will succeed Ayatollah Khamenei in Iran if he dies, 82 years old, bad health. The idea for that newscast came from a question, I believe, here on one live stream. So cool stuff. Keep them coming. One to mention Hezbollah real quick. You can check it out in our archives. We did talk about it on yesterday's newscast. Hey, Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah, the Hezbollah leader, now he reared his head, I guess you would say. He does it from time to time over the past 15 years since the Second Lebanon War in 2006. He's literally been hiding in a bunker, folks, and he's been moving around and hiding and trying to evade Israel. He's afraid he's going to die and that Israel will take him out with an airstrike or through some other means. So he moves around from place to place, and he's been doing that for 15 years. Probably never has a good night's sleep. And he does, however, appear from time to time and give a fiery, blustery speech threatening Israel and threatening the United States from time to time as well, and also threatening Sunni Arab nations. Uh, he very much does not have too many kind words to say when he does emerge from his bunker and from hiding. And once again, he followed that script on Monday. He gave a speech in which this time it was interesting. This was truly a speech delivered by Nasrallah. And again, check it out in the archives for more yesterday's newscast. This truly was a speech for domestic consumption by Nasrallah. He was threatening other Lebanese groups, in particular, a Christian group in Lebanon calling itself the Lebanon Armed Forces. And Nasrallah was saying, if you want war, if you want civil war, because remember what happened last week, we had a Hezbollah rally, a march in the streets of Beirut. Violence broke out. 7 people were killed. Hezbollah instigated the violence, began attacking other groups. And Hezbollah was kind of licking its wounds a little bit after that rally. Some Hezbollah members were killed and injured as well. But now Hezbollah is saying, if you want civil war, don't even think about it because we have 100,000, and I'm quoting Nasrallah, trained fighters, and we can do a lot of damage. And he called out these Lebanese leaders by name. Now, remember, there is this ongoing probe. Well, first of all, before I talk about the probe, just a quick reminder, Hezbollah does not have 100,000 trained fighters. Granted, they likely have 40,000, perhaps as many as 50,000, although that may be a bit high, but they certainly have tens of thousands of well-trained fighters, and they're very dangerous. I consider Hezbollah the world's most dangerous terrorist organization. They're really a terrorist army. They're beyond just a terrorist organization, which is carrying out suicide bombings and stabbings and that kind of thing, which is bad enough. Hezbollah is indeed a well-trained, battle-hardened, battle-tested terrorist army which controls a fairly large territory, all of southern Lebanon, and which has the backing of a state funder, the Iranian regime, state backing of Hezbollah. So combine all those factors, they are indeed the world's most dangerous terror organization, and with an external apparatus as well, capable of carrying out terror attacks on 6 continents. That's Hezbollah. But do they have 100,000 fighters standing? I don't think so. I think that was a little bit of bluster from Nasrallah, but I'm not downplaying Hezbollah. What they do have is dangerous enough and probably a more advanced and more lethal fighting force than the state of Lebanon, the nation of Lebanon's regular armed forces, if you can believe it. So a state within a state is what Hezbollah wields right now. And with the continued instability and chaos in Lebanon, they are looking to flex their muscles even more, along with their patron Iran, and exercise even more influence in that nation as it literally, Lebanon, falls apart economically, politically. People are starving. There is massive unemployment, and it all leads back, much of it, well, leads back much further, but the current woes in large part can lead back to August 2020, what I was mentioning a moment ago, that Beirut port blast and the probe that is ongoing into that blast and Hezbollah's possible involvement in that blast when that ammonium nitrate went up in flames and burnt down a chunk of downtown Beirut, killed hundreds of people, wounded thousands more, left reportedly hundreds of thousands homeless. Hezbollah was storing, according to many Middle East sources, was storing and kind of keeping that ammonium nitrate for itself at the port of Beirut, saving it for future terror attacks. Then someone mishandled it, something went wrong, and as we all know, the mushroom cloud imagery, I guess you would call it, that ammonium nitrate going up in flames. And now Hezbollah doesn't want this probe to go forward. That's why they were marching last week, and they're calling for the lead investigator in the probe to step down. Guess what? Because he wants to investigate Hezbollah, because he's an honest man, apparently. Tarek Bitar is his name. And he's saying, look, I want to interview Hezbollah and question them about what happened here. How dare he? Now, pray for this man's protection, folks. Pray for the entire nation, the people of Lebanon, that things can turn around there. But pray for this man's protection as well. Tarek Bitar, who seems to be an honest man, and he's trying to hold Hezbollah accountable, and they have very sinister intentions towards this man, I believe. So there you have it. Iran, Russia, Hezbollah. We've got about 20 minutes left. I'm going to save China hypersonic missiles. We covered that on, Monday. It was Monday, October 18th, right here in the newscast. And you can check it out in our archives. I did real quick want to mention how I got this scar above, which you can't even really see. It's a miracle of God. Let me tell the story very, very, very quickly, and then we get to the Q&A. Okay, keep the questions coming. We're gonna wind up with the Q&A. Fall 2008. I had not yet given my life to the Lord. I had not yet been born again. I had not yet become a new creation in Christ. I was very close, I believe. Very tumultuous time in my life. My wife, her parents, my in-laws, both passed away back to back 1 month apart. Can you believe it? They were only 57 years old, both of them. They died 1 month apart. It was absolutely devastating to all of us, to my wife. We had a 1-year-old daughter at the time. It was rough, to say the least. At the time, I was living in the Washington, D.C. area, and we were kind of reevaluating our lives and saying, now what? And um, we were saying, okay, do we move back home to Philadelphia, where we're from, and back around family and just reset after this tragedy happened? And we're considering all this, and then I get the opportunity to go to Israel for the very first time, which changed my life. More on that in a second. But at the time, let's just say I was living it up a little bit, and I'd go up to Philly a lot with old friends and kind of hanging out. We're partying and getting together, and this was pre-Jesus days again. But the Philadelphia Phillies are in the World Series. They end up winning the World Series. I'm up there at a big party, a big celebration. And folks, the most bizarre injury of my life, this scar right here happens. And I'll wrap up in a minute, but I want you to hear this to encourage you. I was literally at a buddy's house playing peekaboo with my daughter and a few other girls. And I popped out of a room, and then I would pop back in and pop back out and scare them. They're all 1, 2, 3 years old, little ones. They'd run away and laugh. So I pop out, and then I go to pop back in, and I literally, strange injury, slam my head on the frame of the door. Well, folks, let me tell you, it sliced my head right open. I was, not to get too graphic, bleeding everywhere with my head sliced open. It was unbelievable. I could not believe I couldn't believe what just happened. I was on TV at the time. During this time, I was working for CBN, the Christian Broadcasting Network. This was a Saturday night. I had to go on camera on Monday, I believe. And I said, oh my gosh, I'm going to have a massive scar for the rest of my life. My career is in front of the camera. What am I going to do? And my brother, my older brother, who I love dearly, we're very close. He's a little older than my crowd that I grew up with from Philly. And he usually wouldn't have been with us. He got along great with all of us. He always looked out for us when we were kids, but he just so happened to be at this party, at this get together for the Phillies winning the World Series. Why else would he be there? He was there strategically there to comfort me, always a calming influence in my life. He drove me to the hospital to get stitched up. I'm bleeding everywhere. Folks, let me tell you, I didn't know the Lord yet, and I was close, but I didn't know him personally yet. At that time, I would say I'm definitely an angry guy a lot of times, but a worrier, very worried. Oh, what am I going to do? That kind of thing. Now what? Look at me. What am I going to do? My brother, always calm, always steady. God put the right man in that car to comfort me, take me to the hospital, but it gets even better. I'm sitting in the ER. They take me back, a towel on my head, red with blood. I hate to get so graphic, but it is what it is. And I go into the room to get stitched up. And I'm saying to my brother, look at this. There's no way they can fix this. This girl walks in. She was so serene and so calm. And we start chatting. And I tell her what I do. All I remember is she said she was originally from Pittsburgh, the other side of the state. I was a Philly guy. She was from Pittsburgh. I'm from Pittsburgh, and we're chatting. She had such a calm about her. Right away, my temperature kind of, I kind of exhaled and then, okay, this girl is like soothing me here. And then right before she's going to start stitching, I'm saying to her, hey, be careful. I do, I speak. I'm a public speaker. I'm on TV. I don't want to have this big scar the rest of my life. And she says to me, true story, folks, as she's about to go in, she said, relax. I'm a Christian. I'm going to take good care of you. Do you believe it? And she said those words. And I was so close to coming to the Lord, and I did shortly thereafter, but a peace washed over me when she said that. And I didn't make another peep. I let her do her thing, and she skillfully stitched me up here above my eye. And she was so calm and had she had the Holy Spirit in her. She had the peace that surpasses all understanding. She had the Lord Jesus living inside of her. And when she was done, I just said, you know what? I think it's going to be okay. And she looked at me and she said, you're going to be just fine. You're going to be on TV in no time. It's going to look great. You're young. It's going to clear up. Don't even worry about it. You're going to be fine. Thanked her up and down. Never saw her again. But at the moment I needed it most, when she's like leaning in to stitch me up, she says, don't worry. I'm a Christian. I'm going to take good care of you. And guess what? She did. If you probably can't even really see it, right? Unless I point it out to you every day you're watching the newscast, you can't really see it. She stitched me up, and I'll tell you, I did have to take a few days off, and I was honest with the people at work at CBN. CBN was great to me. They're always great to work for. I'm with TBN now, but CBN was awesome too, and they were so good to me. They said take time. I was honest. As I'm playing peekaboo, I told the story. Freak accident, right? One guy said, did somebody hit you with a beer bottle up in Philly? I know about your past, Stakelbeck. I said, not this time. I swear. It was actually a freak accident. And that's what happened. But something changed in me. I was on the road to changing. Things were changing. I promised questions in 1 minute. Let me finish my point. Usually, I would still stay in Philly for a few extra days and hang out. I hadn't put childish things away, as Paul says. You need to put childish things away. Hadn't done that. It wasn't quite ready to let go of the old life in many ways, and this time was different. I went to the parade downtown here in Philly to celebrate the Phillies winning the World Series. I laughed to myself. I said, God, you're so good. You let me have that parade. You let me have that one last hurrah. I had the stitches in and everything. Everyone's saying, what happened to you? Bandage on my head. But usually I'd stay for a few extra days and hang out. The very next morning after the parade, I looked at my wife and said, let's get out of here. Let's hit the road. She said, are you sure? I said, yeah, let's hit the road. Let's head back. And let's head back down to DC where we were based at the time. And she said, okay, all right. I said, all right, we were staying with my mom. I said, okay, Mom, love you. We're out of here. Now, in 1 week, I was heading to Israel. And it was almost like a threshold was crossed. I said, you know what? Enough now. God, I think, was kind of getting my attention. This little bang on the head. Sometimes he'll gently nudge you. Sometimes he'll hit you in the head. I feel like the Lord was getting my attention in a sense and saying, time to grow up. Spiritually grow up. I want to take you to another level, but I can't do it if you're going to keep kind of doing the same old things and not growing and advancing. Time to grow up. The baby food needs to turn to milk. You need to be fully grown now and grow and be refined and sanctified. And it was almost like I realized that. And I said to myself, God wants to take me to another level. And he did. And a week later, I went to Israel for the first time. And shortly thereafter, I gave my life to the Lord. But I'll tell you, What a prelude to have that happen. What a freak injury. And if you watched before, I've been shot. I have a bullet in my hip. I was beat half to death with a baseball bat. I've got some wild stories in my testimony, in my life journey. And sometimes I think to myself, man, I wish I became a Christian when I was young. I wish I was raised. I'm raising my kids. It's a Christian household. As for me and my family, we will serve the Lord. But when I was young, I was wild and crazy, grown up in Philly, and I could have avoided a lot of trouble and a lot of hassles if I was raised as a born again Bible believer. But if I was, I wouldn't be able to share these stories with you. So God's timing is perfect. It took me 32 years, but I finally gave my life to the Lord. And now I have a testimony that I may not have had if I was a good boy from my earliest years. So I hope that encourages you how God will do that. That's a small slice of my testimony. There's much more to come in the form of a book I'll be working on, and who knows, possibly even a film. But more to come. Let's get to the questions. Thanks for hearing me out there. I hope someone needed to hear that, and I hope that encouraged you. Let's see here. We got some questions coming. And Grace sent me a bunch, so I want to get to some of these. Thank you for humoring me and let me share that story with you. I'm looking at my phone here. Pardon me. Okay, let's get into it. How does the unrest and economy in Lebanon factor into end times prophecy? That's a good question. This is an ongoing debate here in our comments section. We talk a lot about the war of Gog and Magog. Ezekiel 38 and 39, many people are saying, hey, Erick, what about Psalm 83? Many have suggested that Psalm 83 and Lebanon is named. In that Psalm, Tyre and Sidon, I believe, which are in modern day Lebanon, are named in that Psalm 83 confederacy. Many people have said before the war of Gog and Magog, the Ezekiel war, Psalm 83 will unfold. Some have called that the inner ring of nations that surround Israel. We're talking about Gaza, Lebanon, perhaps Syria, nations of the West Bank, which we call Judea and Samaria here in the Watchman Newscast, the biblical heartland, but Israel's immediate borders. That's the inner ring. They say first Israel's got to fight those inner ring nations, then the outer ring, Iran and Turkey and these nations are a bit further away. Then that will be phase 2. This is an interesting one with Psalm 83. Many people believe it was fulfilled in 1948. Others believe it was fulfilled during the Six-Day War of 1967. Tough one. I've thought a lot about this and read a lot about this. And Bill Salas, if you know that name, Bill wrote a really fascinating book about this called Psalm 83. And tough to say definitively if that's unfolded already. I lean towards it perhaps already having taken place in 48 or 67. But let me also say that I do believe there is what I've called the Great Northern War coming. It won't only involve nations to the north, but that's where it will start. I do believe there is a conflict coming before the war of Gog and Magog. Is it what's described in Psalm 83? I don't know. Here's what I do know, or at least what I believe. I believe that a war will start to the north, or perhaps it could start to the south, but the north gets involved. What do I mean by that? Well, you have Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza. Say they go at it again with Israel and things heat up again, once again in Gaza. Hezbollah held its fire back in May of this year during the last round. Perhaps Hezbollah and Iran say, now's the time. Islamic Jihad and Hamas are creating a distraction in Gaza down south. Now to the north, we will get involved. And now's the time. And then the great war happens. Most of the action will be to the north. Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad are serious threats, but Iran and Hezbollah are another level. That's one scenario. The other scenario is it starts in the north. Israel, Hezbollah start going at it, and then Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad throw their hats in the ring, so to speak, and start firing rockets as well. And then Iran activates that entire ring of fire. The Houthis start launching rockets, and Iraqi Shia militias start launching rockets from the east, from Iraq, drones, and the whole thing ignites. So I do think that war, perhaps a more limited war, is coming before the war of Gog and Magog. The big question would be, is that Psalm 83 and what's described in Psalm 83? That's a tough one. And I'm not trying to evade the question. If you know me, I answer things head on. I don't pull punches. I tell it like it is. I try to. But I got to tell you, Psalm 83 is tough because it does seem to describe what happened in 1948 and 1967. And I say that chiefly because Egypt, the Hagarites, I believe, are mentioned in Psalm 83, is talking about Egypt being involved. And certainly Egypt was the main adversary for Israel in 1948 and 67 in those wars. We'll continue to talk about it. Interesting conversation, right? Very interesting. Okay, let's see what else we have. We've got like hundreds of questions today. This is pretty, this is great. I'm getting what I get. And thank you for letting me fit in the testimony story, because I think that's important too, to encourage people that God will never leave you or forsake you. Never. And he's merciful and loyal. I didn't deserve to have that woman stitching me up. I was a knucklehead at the time, but God put her in that room with me. Does Iran feel emboldened with Joe Biden in office? I can answer that in one word. Yes. If you're watching the newscast every day, you know that very well. Okay, let's see. Erick, this is interesting. Get this. Do you know anything about the rumored plans to rebuild the city of Babylon? I haven't heard too much about this. Now, in the book of Revelation, we know Mystery Babylon. Is that literally a rebuilt city of Babylon? Interesting question. There have been rumblings over the years about Babylon being rebuilt. Saddam Hussein wanted to rebuild Babylon. It was in the works for him. But there have been some international voices as well who have talked about this too. My friend Joel Rosenberg, you've probably seen Joel on the Watchman Newscast and the Watchman TV show. He's written some great books, best-selling, awesome books, because they're fiction, but they're true to life, and they're scriptural, they're prophetic, they're awesome. In one of those books, I think Joel wrote about that scenario, the city of Babylon literally being rebuilt. So I haven't heard too much about those plans, but in today's Middle East, expect the unexpected. I would not be shocked if some new mega city was built in Iraq at some date and they called it Babylon or New Babylon. I would not be shocked. We have the Saudis right now. It's not Babylon what they're building, but they're building a large city as well called Neom, Neom. I believe it's called Neom, in the Saudi desert, which is going to be a big kind of mega city. It's not Babylon. That would be, you assume, on the ruins of ancient Babylon or somewhere in that vicinity. But cool question there, and thought provoking. We'll keep an eye on that as well. Let's see. How much, let's see. Sorry. A few questions all kind of hit on the same thing here. Is this, is Israel, not that Israel's blustering, but is Israel kind of setting out a warning to Iran? Is Israel basically kind of the boy who cried wolf scenario? Several people asked, is Israel just leaking these threats and these plans to scare Iran and to dissuade Iran from going nuclear? Certainly, Israel is using the rhetoric in part to discourage Iran from going nuclear, without a doubt. That is part of the strategy, to not only verbalize it, but to have action behind those words, and to let Iran know that you mean what you say. I think Israel, over the past few years, with the consistent sabotage attacks against Iran's nuclear facilities, we've documented them here time and time on the newscast, and the taking out of Iranian scientist Mohsen Fakhrizadeh almost a year ago now, November 2020. I think there has been teeth, there has been bite behind Israel's words, time and time again, striking Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile factories and facilities through sabotage, mysterious explosions, and setting the nuclear program back, certainly even using computer viruses to do that. So clearly, Israel has a proven track record of taking action in Syria, as we discussed earlier, and taking bold action. So you would think that Iran has to think twice when Israel says what it is saying, that hey, we have $1 billion budget devoted to destroying your nuclear program, and we're not going to allow you to go nuclear. Um, so if this was Joe Biden, perhaps, and he was saying, we're going to hit you and we won't allow you to do this. We'll bring every last American home. The Taliban will not seize Kabul within the month. If it was someone like that bringing forth this rhetoric, then you might laugh, shake your head, and wave them off and say, yeah, whatever. But in the case of Israel, there has been teeth behind their words. There has been action behind their words. So certainly Iran will perhaps not think twice. They'll be more careful, but train with no brakes, right? Iran is hell bent. They are obsessed with having a nuclear capability, demonically driven, in my view, to getting the bomb. So they won't listen to reason quite clearly. So Israel will do ultimately what it feels it needs to do. We're out of time and we have a million questions. I apologize. You guys are the best. Love you all. Can't do without you. I love these live streams because it's more conversational. I can share my heart a little bit and let you know me a little bit, little bit more of my story and my life. If you're watching every day, you should know a little bit about what makes me tick and where I come from. So this was great. Hey, we're creeping up on 400,000 subscribers. So if you have not subscribed or you know someone who hasn't subscribed, please subscribe and spread the word and tell other people to subscribe to the Watchman News channel. Click the notification bell. I'd love to hit 400,000 in the coming days. That would be awesome. And keep it up. Keep on keeping on. God bless all of you. I will see you tomorrow here in the newscast. Until then, thanks for joining us. And remember, never hold your peace. See you soon.